Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses. On this episode, I'd like to take a pause to think about one of the issues that comes up repeatedly with many of the people I coach, and particularly around this time of year. And that issue is scheduling, or perhaps more directly, where did the time go? Often when I'm reflecting with someone around this time of year, and they might be a principal, a head of school, or a different leader, they'll look back at the year and say, I really wish I'd spent more time doing X. That X might be meetings with my team. It might be one-on-one mentoring. It might be spending time in classrooms. It can be any of these things. But what happens, unfortunately, more often than not, is that we get to the end of the year and we find ourselves wishing we might have spent more time doing something slightly different than what we actually did. And this admittedly is a very difficult thing to adjust and compensate for within the year itself. You're going from day to day, from week to week. It's hard to make those midstream adjustments. The summer, on the other hand, is an amazing opportunity to do just that. And the approach that I like to take, and I'd like to share it with you now, is what I call zero-based scheduling. Now, some of you may be familiar with zero-based budgeting. That's where we take this concept from. And I think there's a lot of pieces that we can really learn from there. The idea of zero-based budgeting is next year's budget shouldn't start with all the givens, all the accepted items of this year's budget, and just get rolled over. Maybe a slight adjustment, a slight tweak, a slight raise or lowering. Zero-based budgeting says, when I look at next year's budget, I start with zero, a completely blank slate. Now, obviously, that makes the budgeting process take a little bit longer. So why do you do that? The idea is that if I start with zero, I then can force myself, either alone or with a small team, to make an argument for why each item that I'm adding to next year's budget deserves to be there. Why each item needs to be there, why each item, hopefully, is in some way a reflection of my school's values, my organization's values, with some dollar signs attached to it that enable us to implement and act on those values. I like to take people through the same exercise, but on the scheduling side. So what we do is we take last year's schedule and we wipe it entirely clean. Now, if you have standing meetings with people, I'm not saying go cancel all your invites and they'll think that you've taken off somewhere. You don't have to do that at this moment. But I want you, at least in your head, and it's ideal if you can use a spreadsheet or even a piece of paper to do this, start from zero. Think about how many work hours you have in the week. Now, think realistically, the number of work hours in the week should not be 80, should not even be 70, right? Somewhere in the normal range of work hours in your week. Those are the hours that you have to play with. And at this moment, nothing is in those hours. Now, when you look at that blank sheet, whether it's a computer screen or a piece of paper, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And that's actually a good thing because we latch on to last year's scheduling routines simply because they're natural. That's what we've been doing. So it's the easiest thing to just fall into that pattern. But when we look at a blank piece of paper or a blank screen, we're forced to ask ourselves, okay, well, where should I start? Where should my time go over the coming years? And that's where we don't want to start with an individual meeting. Say, you know what? I should meet with Mrs. Smith. I should meet with Mr. Johnson. No. What we want to do first with that blank slate is to think in terms of categories. What are the things that are most important for you to accomplish in your job, in your role for next year? So these categories might look like supporting my leaders with one-on-one mentoring. They might look like team building with my leadership team. They might look like connecting with stakeholders, whether those are lay leaders in one category or perhaps connecting with parents as a different category. There might be a piece for school leaders of connecting with teaching and learning. So what kind of time can I devote to connecting with students, to connecting in classrooms? And I'm looking at this in terms of categories, because if I think in categories, it helps me really connect these to priorities. So, as a leader, one of my priorities is supporting my team. One of them is supporting my team members as individuals. One of them is supporting my team and working together strategically as a team. One of them may be partnering with my lay leadership, board president, other board members. One of them may be connecting to teaching and learning. And I outline each of those as priority categories on my sheet. Again, no meetings yet. I play with them. I tweak them a little bit. I think about, how much time and energy do I want to devote to each of these? The same way we would do with a budget. And the thing is, with a budget, we're playing with money. And yes, that's vital. But perhaps not as vital or as crucial as this kind of budget, which is budgeting our own time, energy, and attention, because that ultimately is how we as leaders make an impact. And so we assign how much budget, how many hours on a typical week do we want to devote to category A, B, C, and D. And again, we double check that those hours aren't adding up to 80 or 90 or some other crazy amount there. They need to add up to the reasonable number of hours that we work in our own work weeks. And obviously we're talking, somewhere in the 40, 50 range, perhaps. Each person can decide on their own, but it should be reasonable. And once we've done that, and we've sort of assigned these hours in terms of priority, now we can go and think about, okay, well, I'd like to devote this many hours to staff, this many hours to classroom visits, this many hours to parents, this many hours to board and other lay leadership. Now, what does that look like? How many times am I going into classes? For how much time? How much time am I spending walking the halls? How do I do my one-on-ones with my direct reports? How do I do my work with my team? And I think about that again, not yet in terms of the minutes per se, but in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish, keeping it in the frame of my priorities. And only after I've done a couple of rounds of looking at this and reviewing it and thinking about whether these match my priorities, do I now say, okay, I've got my categories. I've got a rough number of hours that I think I ought to be spending in each one. I've got a rough sense of what I want to accomplish in each of these categories. Now let's actually rebuild the schedule and rebuild it from scratch. So again, we take a blank schedule, and based on our priorities, we start to build upwards and put these various pieces into place. Now, exactly how you do this depends on your approach to calendaring and how you manage your workday, whether it's in your Google Calendar or Outlook, or whether it's in some other way, depends on how you function. But it needs to be done in some way that will allow you to come back to it and check on it. So Google Calendar has a great feature where if you actually color code your categories when you set up meetings, you'll be able to look at any week or month and it'll automatically generate the percentages for you of where your time has gone. For others who are less tech focused when it comes to scheduling, we just take a piece of paper or a simple Word file and we outline what the priorities are. And then we make a reminder for ourselves that, yes, this year is going to start. We'll have started off balanced, but a month into the year, we know we could be off in one direction or the other. And so we're going to make a note in our calendar to come back to this file every month or so. You can do that on your own. I actually used to do this together with my assistant when I was ahead of school, who was super helpful because number one, it meant that I wasn't canceling the meeting because somebody else was there. But she and I would sit and look at my calendar together and say, hey, does this reflect the kind of leadership that I want to be implementing here? Does this reflect the kind of head that I want to be? And typically the answer was, yeah, in some ways, but in other ways, maybe it needs a bit of work. And so we would adjust and we would take a look at the next month's calendar and see how can we tweak? How can we move? And again, some people take this by a block scheduling approach where they literally block off time on their calendars for walking around the building, classroom visits, schmoozing with staff, all those little things that wouldn't necessarily happen if they got crowded out by meeting after meeting after meeting. And for some people, really that approach doesn't quite work. It's a little bit too regimented, but the reflecting backwards and then looking ahead at how much time is blocked off for those meetings that are set on my calendar, and does that leave enough time for all the things I want to do? So if you know me, you know that I'm a fan of pre-blocking. I think that we do have to black out times on our calendar for walking around the building, being in classrooms, sitting in the faculty room, being by the front door during arrival and dismissal and other key gathering times, because otherwise things will get in there that prevent us from being where we want to be. But however you do it, the key is not to take a last year's calendar and last year's week as the default, but to actually start from scratch and rebuild based on your priorities. Now, this works for the average week, right? The typical week. And anybody running a school will say, yeah, that's great. But I'm pretty sure that there are somewhere around 0 typical weeks in a 40-week school year. And that may be true, but you need to have a base to start with. And then if you're ready to level up and take the next level of complexity here, what you want to do is then think not only in terms of the rhythm of the week, but in terms of the rhythm and the energy of the year. So we know there are certain times of year where we may have a annual campaign, crowdfunding campaign, dinner, where we may have graduation season, where we may have winter break, or we may have parent-teacher conferences, all sorts of things that come into our year as leaders that can often throw us off. Now, these things have to happen, but rather than letting them happen to us, when we think about our schedule on our calendar over the summer, I would encourage us to be a little bit more proactive about how we intend to navigate those. So, for example, I know that the first 2 weeks of December are my intense fundraising weeks. We have our crowdfunding campaign or our dinner in mid-December before winter break. This is what I'm going to have to spend hours upon hours doing that. Or a certain time of the year, I'm going to have to do a lot of admissions interviews, or I'm going to have to do a lot of hiring interviews, some exit interviews with teachers or students that are graduating, moving on. There are things that are going to come in that I can more or less predict seasonally and take up my calendar. And so what I'm going to want to do is decide in advance, okay, well, when I do have these times, how am I going to balance that? Again, we don't just want to add all those hours. That doesn't typically work. And usually when you try and do that, something falls out and it wasn't necessarily the thing that you wanted or intended to fall out. But we can say, for example, look, this year, I want to spend a lot of time in teacher classrooms. So I want to have that be a significant component of my calendar. And at the same time, I know that these 2 weeks in December are going to be a really difficult time to get everything in because I've got this other fundraising responsibility that I've got to pitch in on then. So when I'm looking at the schedule of my year, I may decide to go a little bit heavier on my classroom visits in September, October, November. Understand that December is going to be a lighter month, but, and this is the crucial piece, bring those classrooms back in January and February. Because what typically happens, and this is where we often go off course, is that we're set, we're moving, we've got our calendar, and then we have one of these intensive time periods. And in that intensive time period, we appropriately put some things on the back burner and dive into the needs of those 2 weeks. The difficult thing is at the end of those 2 weeks, we don't come back and re-add those things. Again, I'm using classroom visits because it's often one that we'd love to do more of. We don't add it back as quickly as we dropped it because we didn't drop it proactively. We didn't plan to drop it. But if I've created my calendar for the year, and in my calendar, I've noted, hey, September, October, November are going to be great months for spending lots of time in the classroom. December, I'm going to need to take a couple weeks off, but that means I'm going to really try and make sure I double down on these in January and February and getting them back in there. Then we can set a mechanism in place in advance to rebalance ourselves around all those times that we know we might get thrown off, whether it's a lot or a little. And so as you're thinking about this summer and you have that time to really take a little bit of a deep breath, look at things new, I'd really encourage you to experiment with this. Try taking your calendar down to 0. No commitments, no obligations, no meetings. And then, piece by piece, set up your priority categories. Think about what you want to fill those categories, and then assign that to specific actions and specific times and build your typical week. Figure out how to either put it in your calendar on an ongoing basis or have some other way to remind yourself, because we know that we'll need these reminders to keep us balanced over the course of the year. And then, if you're up for it, take that next step of pre-planning how you'll navigate each of these times when we are thrown off somewhat, where our attention is pulled somewhere else. And so we know we're going to have to rebalance then and come back. It might mean you do certain things a little bit earlier than planned, right? We're going to put in more meetings with a certain category in May because we know June is going to be graduation and other end of year ceremony and party time. It may mean that you push other things later, but across the board, what it means is that you can take a thoughtful and proactive approach. And hopefully by the end of the next year, yes, there will always be things you wish you did more of, but by the end of next year, hopefully we can look back and say, I intended to spend my time and energy in certain ways, and I came pretty close. I was proactive. I was thoughtful. I made the best use of really my most precious resource, which is my own time and my own energy. Try it out. I'd love to hear how it goes for you. And you can reach me to let me know, as always, at Leadership Lenses on Substack, Barry Kislowitz on LinkedIn, or on our website, kislowitzconsulting.com.